Let's go to our guest. Joining me in Cambridge, Massachusetts is Subrata Ghoshroy, a researcher at MIT's Science, Technology and Society program. In Atlanta, Georgia is Laura Seward Forczyk. She's the founder of the space analysis and consulting firm Astralytical. And Dean Cheng is in Washington, D.C. He's a senior researcher on national security and foreign policy at the Heritage Foundation's Asian Studies Center. Good to have you all on the Newsmakers. Dean Cheng, let me start with you. When we hear the French say that we want to put machine guns on our satellites in outer space, should we all be worried?
Well, I think first off, I'm not sure that they literally meant machine guns. That would probably do bad things to the spacecraft that was mounting them. But no, I think that what we are seeing is a ongoing process where nations are realizing that their space capabilities are vulnerable, are valuable, and therefore need to be protected. Whether or not there are kinetic systems that are put in place or jammers or other things, we should expect to see a variety of space weapons being deployed.
So, Subrata Ghoshroy, we almost accepted a certain element of militarization of space. Do we naturally have to accept a weaponization of space and maybe some of the rivalries and conflicts that are happening down on Earth starting to manifest themselves in space as well?
No, not at all. I think that we have lived with a so-called militarized space for 50, 60 years now since the launch of the Sputnik. And the mutual respect of space assets by the superpowers, knowing fully well that weaponization or warfare in space will be suicidal for all.
But that's what they're doing, right? I'm not sending up these weapons, and they're saying we need to protect our satellites, so we need to protect them in every and any way that we know. So I know you're hopeful that this won't be suicidal, but aren't they doing it anyway?
Well, in this regard, I think that the US has a lot of responsibility into the situation that we find ourselves in. It's the leader of the free world, so-called free world. It's a leader, economic leader, military leader in the world. And instead of setting an example that we can actually control space from getting further weaponized and to avert any future eventuality, if we might call it that way, of a warfare, that is only doable with diplomacy and treaty. And
Right.
so far, we have that example.
Right. So, Laura, the 1967 Outer Space Treaty bans weapons in space, and you can't use weapons of mass destruction. It says that countries should only use space for peaceful purposes and so on. Are those treaties now under threat given recent moves by countries such as the United States and what's announced by the French and the Chinese and the Russians and so on?
Well, to clarify, the Outer Space Treaty says that you can't have weapons of mass destruction or nuclear weapons in space. It does not say you can't have any weapons in space. And it says that outer planetary bodies are meant for peaceful purposes. It does not say that Earth orbit is meant for peaceful purposes. So unfortunately, we are seeing an increase in militarization that is harmful for all parties, not in terms of protecting assets, but in terms of destroying assets, whether it's disabling a satellite or creating space debris by kinetic means. Those are harmful not only to the adversaries that are being targeted, but also to the entire global population that uses the orbital space of Earth. And unfortunately, we're going to continue to see more and more of these anti-satellite tests and demonstrations until there is leadership put in place to take a stance against them.
Right. Okay. So, Dean, let me be the simpleton here, because I am. So we know that space is used in order to wage war on Earth. We know that satellites are very useful and so on, right? They help countries war on Earth. And give them maybe a qualitative advantage. But how would you actually find countries fighting each other in space? How does that play out? Is it just taking out each other's satellites? Is there anything beyond that?
Well, there's a great deal. I mean, obviously, a lot of this at this point is still conjectural, since nobody's actually fought a war in space. But what we already see is a variety of different counter space capabilities. For example, if you can figure out how to turn off your adversary's satellite, or simply make them turn away, then in that case, that satellite, which is overflying my country, if it's looking in the other direction or has turned itself off for the time it's overhead, is every bit as useless to your military planning as if I had fired an anti-satellite rocket at it. If I can hack into the control networks and deorbit the satellites, I haven't created debris. In fact, I could try and do this very safely, but nonetheless, you now have no satellites in space. I'm afraid, however, I have to disagree with the professor from MIT. To lay this at the feet of the United States is a fascinating exercise. I mean, India just recently conducted an ASAT test. India, which has long claimed, to want to express leadership, third way, et cetera, it has chosen to join the ranks of military capabilities in space. Why is it that why is India less responsible for this? China, of course, conducted the most debris-generating event in space with its 2007 ASAT test.
Okay.
Is that somehow
right? Let's ask the professor.
The responsibility of the US?
So Subrata Ghoshroy, it's not just the US, it's India, it's Israel, it's Russia, it's China, it's France, it's Japan. Why just the US?
I'm primarily talking about leadership here. It's certainly countries with a ballistic missile program can shoot down satellites, which has been demonstrated already by 4 countries, and if Japan wants to do it or whoever can do it. But India's space capability is nothing in terms of the enterprise's size and budget spending. You just have to look at a comparison with the United States. So I am, of course, saying that given that the leaders, and this is not just the United States, but the United States is the leader of the pack in pushing towards weaponization, and other countries which have many different kind of agenda. And I have written about this, that the Indian decision to destroy its own satellite 2-3 weeks before the election was motivated by electoral prospects of Prime Minister Modi. So they are just followers. And we have, the United States, we have blocked any consideration of a treaty that is proposed by the Chinese and the Russians since 2008 to prevent arms race in space, and we have blocked it completely.
Okay. I want us to have a little listen. Just a second, Dean. I'm going to add something to what the professor said, and then you can respond. Let's have a little listen to U.S. Vice President Mike Pence.
And today, other nations are seeking to disrupt our space-based systems and undermine our economic and military might as never before. For many years, nations from Russia and China to North Korea and Iran have pursued weapons to jam, blind, and disable our navigation and communication satellites through electronic attacks from the ground. But recently, our adversaries have been working to bring new weapons of war into space itself.
Okay, so I wonder what kind of leadership is needed, Dean, given these circumstances?
Well, I think that insofar as quote-unquote leadership is needed, one aspect of leadership is recognizing when the other side is not negotiating in good faith. When you look at the Russian and Chinese proposals for the prevention of an arms race in outer space, we find that none of their anti-satellite systems would be covered by this. For example, the 2007 anti-satellite test, which was a ground-launched interceptor which blew up a Chinese weather satellite, generating several thousand pieces of debris, that would be perfectly legal, even if Paris, the Prevention of the Arms Race in Outer Space Treaty that they proposed, were put in place. Now, to suggest that somehow the U.S., again, is failing to show leadership because it will not sign on to a one-sided treaty that the Russians and Chinese would benefit from, I find that a fascinating definition of leadership. I don't think that that's what Vice President Pence had in mind.
Okay, Laura, should the U.S. be leading by example here?
We should be, but under this administration and previous administrations, we've seen a lack of willingness to do so when it comes to taking a stance against kinetic ASAT demonstrations or tests or capabilities that would harm not only our adversaries, but the global population that uses space. So we're not talking about just targeting one satellite of an enemy and having it be done with. We're talking about creation of space debris that may or may not quickly deorbit, that may be harmful to other satellites, to the International Space Station, to rocket launches, to really anybody that uses the space. Unfortunately, we have seen in our current political climate a lack of willingness to put together new treaties. And so I do not see this changing anytime soon. Perhaps with future leadership, they might be more willing to use diplomatic or non-kinetic ways of protecting space assets.
Right. Laura, I'm glad that you mentioned the International Space Station, because you have countries that fundamentally disagree on so many things. At the same time that a country might be accusing the other of hacking their election, for example, you'd have two astronauts from the two countries working together in the International Space Station. A lot of goodwill, a symbol that the nonsense that we disagree on back on Earth, that doesn't matter up in space because this is for all of humanity. Do you think that with these recent developments, that kind of symbolism and cooperation in the International Space Station might come under threat?
No, no. The International Space Station and similar partnerships in the past have proven to be very robust when it comes to geopolitical concerns. In fact, we've seen more cooperation in space than we have on Earth in a lot of cases. And so I wouldn't be surprised to see that continued partnership both in Earth orbit as well as future plans to go to the moon.
Subrata Ghoshroy, you agree?
I very much agree with Laura about her characterization of the U.S. position developing over administrations. It is not just Trump. It was Obama before that, it was Clinton. But one point I want to make about what Dr. Cheng had said about the Paros treaty negotiations, and that is, we cannot just say because the opening proposal for negotiations contains something we don't like. It is the negotiation that we are blocking, not the content of the proposal. Obviously, as we negotiate, many things will be included, deleted, and so forth. We will have a rolling text. But to say that the first draft contains something we don't like, so we don't want to play, and we're taking our marbles and going home, that is ridiculous. And so as far as the other thing is concerned, yeah, totally. I also want to point out, I just came back from Russia. I was on a study tour, and I visited the Space Museum in Moscow. It was a fantastic experience. And then I come back, and I was watching television, and Frank Borman there was a clip from the '69 Borman going to Cornell and getting heckled after the moon landing. And he was received so warmly by the Russian people when he went. And the space program, the civilian space program, has been a superb example of international cooperation. As we know, without the Russian cooperation, we can't service the ISS right now.
Dean Cheng?
Well, I think it's interesting to consider that the reason the Russians are on the International Space Station today is precisely because of the end of the Cold War. Had the Cold War not ended, it is very difficult to imagine that there would be a U.S.-Russian partnership along with Canada and Japan and all these other countries. So far from space being the leading indicator, space is arguably the trailing indicator. Now, at the moment, U.S.-Russian relations are cooling down, but there is still cooperation. But if, and certainly no one I think wants to see this, there were a return to a very frigid state of U.S.-Russian relations, the fate of the ISS could become more problematic. And let me note here that Vladimir Putin and other Russian officials have now talked about raising the cost of taking astronauts to the ISS, accusing non-Russian crew people of actively trying to sabotage the ISS. So I'm afraid that space reflects what happens on Earth rather than being independent of it.
Laura Seward, Forczyk, Subrata Ghoshroy, and Dean Cheng, good to have you all on the Newsmakers.